My name is Irene Castor. I'm 24 years old, born and raised in Sedgeport, a coastal town in Maine that smells like salt, wet pine, and books older than I am. My parents are the kind of people strangers admire and children fear. My mother, Virginia Castor, is the head mistress of Briar Hill Academy, a boarding school so uptight you'd swear it ironed its students flat. My father, Dr. Alden Castor, teaches ornithology at Penobscot University and once published a paper called Beak Morphology and Shoreline Feeding Efficiency in Juvenile Terns. Dinner conversations in our house sounded like footnotes. And my brother Miles, he was the golden one, first to win a state science fair, first published before age 20, and now a rising star in ecological research. I was the second child, the afterthought, the one who couldn't quite get the hang of fitting in their blueprint. While Miles was breeding biodegradable algae systems in the garage, I was in the attic restoring a Victorian pendulum clock I'd found at a church sale. It was rusted solid, missing 2 gears, and looked like it hadn't ticked since Nixon resigned. But I got it working again. I was 12. By 16, I was known around the neighborhood as the weather vane girl. People brought me all kinds of broken relics, barometers, compass roses, hand crank radios, and I'd fix them for free or in exchange for spare parts. I loved it. Every gear, every lever had its own language. You just had to listen. My parents? Not so much. Restoring scrap won't restore your future, my mother liked to say. Usually while flipping through enrollment brochures for liberal arts colleges she'd strategically left on the kitchen table. You've got the brains, Irene, my father would add, but you're wasting them on crafts for the unmotivated. One night I told them I wouldn't be applying to college. I said it out loud while they were watching Miles accept another academic award over dinner. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. I told them I was going to open a mechanical restoration business near the harbor, a real one, with signage and a workbench and everything. The silence that followed was thick and bright, like lightning before the strike. My father laughed first, one of those single-note clipped chuckles that meant trouble. "A shop," he said, eyes narrowed behind his glasses. "You're throwing away your future to fix toys?" "They're not toys," I said, "and it's not throwing anything away." He stood up so fast his chair scraped the tile. "I won't have my daughter playing junk merchant while wearing our name. You want to be a tradeswoman, fine, but do it out of this house?" That was the moment I knew they weren't going to budge, and neither was I. I packed my things that night. Not clothes, not keepsakes. Just my tools, my sketches, and a dented brass sextant that still worked if you tilted it just right. I left Sedgeport at dawn. No note, no goodbye. Miles never called. But the clock I'd fixed before I left, it still ticked. And that was enough. I was leaving behind a family that cared more about legacy than love, and I was done trying to earn their approval. The fishing village was smaller than Sedgeport, but windier, saltier. I rented a crumbling storefront wedged between a bait shop and a cafe that only served haddock chowder and instant coffee. The for-lease sign had been bleached pink by sun and time, but the landlord didn't care what I did with the place, as long as the checks cleared. I called it Castor Works, not to honor the family name, but to reclaim it. The floors creaked like knees in February, and the ceiling leaked when it rained, but the space was perfect. I scrubbed the windows, patched the plaster, and brought in every mechanical orphan I could find. Tide clocks, ship compasses, barographs, sextants with fogged lenses. I found a rusted marine wind gauge in a junk pile behind a marine supply store and restored it in 3 days. That first winter nearly broke me. Locals were skeptical. Some were amused. One guy came in holding a busted weather vane and asked, "So what trade school did you say you went to?" I told him I didn't. He didn't come back. Word spread slowly, and business trickled in like fog. Some fishermen needed their old wind compasses recalibrated. One woman brought in a box of broken typewriters from her grandfather's attic. I fixed 3 and turned the 4th into a kinetic sculpture that looked like it was breathing. I slept in the back of the shop most nights, curled up between spools of copper wire and boxes of brass screws. I lived on canned chowder, mostly. Heat came from a dented radiator that worked when it felt like it. I started selling some of my restored pieces online, barometers mounted in reclaimed wood, glass marine clocks rewired with subtle LEDs. The sales barely covered materials, but it kept the lights on. Still, by the end of February, I was tired, cold. My hands cracked constantly from the wind and the tools. I hadn't spoken to anyone for more than 5 minutes in weeks. I thought about quitting almost every night. I even wrote a draft of a Craigslist ad for my tools. Then came the regional crafts fair. I almost didn't go. It was $20 to rent a table, and I barely had 30 to my name. But I went. I packed a folding crate with a few restored navigational instruments and one weather sculpture I'd built from old fish scale gauges and a broken phonograph arm. The crowd was small, mostly retirees selling driftwood art and watercolor postcards. My table got a few glances, a couple compliments, and then a woman with sharp eyes and a half-shaved head stopped in front of my sculpture and just stared. "That's marine telemetry," she said, pointing to the rotating top piece. "But it's responding to ambient motion?" "Gyroscopic pendulum," I said, counterweighted with analog feedback. She grinned like someone had just handed her a solution she didn't know she needed. Her name was Tamsin Yarrow. She worked in museum logistics, specifically in exhibit flow and automation systems. "We usually have to contract 3 separate people to handle design, restoration, and control logic," she said. "But this is all in one." I nodded, unsure what to say. Tamsin handed me her card and said, "Don't give up. You don't know how rare this is." It was the first time someone had seen what I did and called it valuable. Not quaint, not a hobby, valuable. That night, I didn't rewrite the Craigslist ad. I cleaned my tools, made a list of materials, and let myself imagine, for the first time, what Casterworks could become. Tamsin showed up at the shop 3 weeks later in a slate gray hatchback, with 2 large takeaway coffees and a folder full of blueprints. She said she had a small gig, consulting work for a maritime museum, looking to update their automation systems without gutting their historic artifacts. "They want smoother exhibit transitions," she explained. "But everything's built on analog timers from the 50s. They don't want digital screens. They want authenticity with functionality. You're the first person I thought of." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a systems engineer. I was good with gears and pulleys, brass and balance, but building something to manage an entire exhibit's automation, that was a leap. But Tamsin just looked at me and said, "You're already doing it. Just scale up." So I did. We started with one museum in Bar Harbor. I spent 2 weeks on site studying their exhibit. An old ship hull cross-section with a rotating storm simulation and tide pool mock-up. Everything was run by clunky motors and a Frankenstein tangle of relays. I didn't replace them, I augmented them. Added modular controls, custom relays, and a mechanical programming disk. I machined myself to synchronize movement with sound and light. When we finished, the exhibit ran like it was breathing. A 10-minute loop timed with perfect motion and soft ambient cues. The curator stood there blinking at it like we'd just conjured ghosts. After that, Tamsin said we needed to build a company around it. "Not just Casterworks," she said. "Caster Systems. Restoration meets interface design." She was serious. She even drew up a mock-up logo with a compass needle forming the letter C. I wasn't ready, but I also didn't want to go back to canned chowder and sleeping next to copper spools. So I started prototyping new modules. Clockwork relays with fail-safes. Hybrid control panels that could be manually adjusted even if power failed. I built a system that could run an entire diorama using only ambient barometric pressure as its trigger. We brought in an intern named Noel, a lanky engineering student from Orono, who lived and breathed analog to digital conversion. He took one look at my rotating exhibit controller and said, "This is like Rube Goldberg got an EE degree. I love it." He never left. We worked nights, Noel handling the code that translated analog signals to digital relays, me machining gears and building the tactile interfaces. Tamsin organized meetings with board members and pitched us as heritage engineers. I wasn't sure what that meant, but people liked it. Our first big pitch was to a coastal heritage consortium, a collection of 7 small museums trying to modernize without losing their charm. They had almost no budget, and their existing systems were literally powered by household light timers. We underbid every contractor by half. We got the job. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid off my winter debts. It bought me a new soldering station. It gave Noel a stipend and me a reason to stop sleeping on the shop floor. Caster Systems was real. Not a dream, not a project. a business. And for the first time in my life, I saw my work not as an escape from legacy, but the beginning of one, my own. 3 years after I'd walked out of my parents' house with nothing but a box of tools, I stood in the conference hall of a downtown Boston hotel, giving a live demo to the New England Lighthouse Heritage Council. I wore a black jumpsuit with my logo embroidered over the heart, Castor Systems in clean lines around a compass motif Noel had designed. In front of me sat a scale model of an old Fresnel lens exhibit, modified with programmable shutters and a synchronized wind simulation I'd built from repurposed HVAC parts. When I pulled the lever and the room dimmed to replicate a storm, the sound design and lens rotation kicked in like clockwork. The council members watched, mouths slightly open as light refracted off the simulated fog we'd generated using ultrasonic mist. Noel stood off stage with the Q tablet, grinning like a kid at a science fair. Tamsin leaned against the wall, arms crossed, looking like someone who already knew we'd won. By the end of the week, we'd signed a contract. 32 lighthouse exhibit sites up and down the New England coast, retrofitted over 12 months. The total contract, $360,000. We didn't celebrate with champagne. We celebrated with fried clams, a new parts order, and a used box truck Noel found on Craigslist that we painted matte gray and filled with gear. I updated our business license. We moved into a proper workspace, still near the harbor, but with an office, 2 lathe stations, and an actual doorbell that chimed like a ship's bell. We hired 2 part-timers. I started training them myself, just like I wished someone had trained me, with hands, not lectures, with diagrams in pencil, not PDFs. I lived modestly. I still patched my coveralls with the same sewing kit I'd had since high school. I still rode my old bike when it wasn't snowing. I didn't talk about my family. Not even when Castor Systems was mentioned in a regional magazine under top 10 companies redefining New England innovation. But life has a way of clawing back, even when you think you've moved on. It was Noel who brought the mail in one day, flipping through it like always. "Hey boss," he said, holding up a tattered envelope. "Think this got sent here by mistake. Some tax notice addressed to a doctor. Alden Castor." I froze. Sure enough, it was a forwarded property tax delinquency slip, my father's name, his old address. In the same stack was a nondescript pharmacy bill under my mother's name. Out-of-pocket costs. High ones. They were in trouble. Still, no one had called. No one had written. To them, I was probably still sleeping on a cot in a leaky shop, patching together weather vanes for grocery money. While I was negotiating contracts and building automation for historic sites, my family still believed I was a failure. I stared at those bills for a long time. Then I quietly slid them into a drawer. They didn't know. And for now, I wasn't going to tell them. I never intended to get involved again. I told myself I owed them nothing, but I kept looking at that drawer, at the unpaid tax notice with my father's name, and the medication invoice with my mother's scribbled address. They were proud enough to ignore what I'd become, but not proud enough to turn down help if it came with the right disguise. So I gave them one. It started with a shell company, North Channel Heritage Fund. I filed the paperwork through a nonprofit umbrella service, created a modest website with generic maritime language, and set up a trust to distribute anonymous microgrants. Then I made the first call. A man named Emerson, a retired professor who owed my dad a favor, agreed to reach out with a research opportunity. A quiet contract, generously paid, to write a guide on avian field education for heritage institutions. It landed in my father's inbox a week later with a note. "We've long admired your work from afar. Your legacy deserves to be recorded." My mother's prescriptions were trickier. I created a grant for retired educators with documented service in underfunded regions, sent through a regional endowment program I quietly funded. A pharmacy tech handled the billing. They never asked where the money came from. They never asked because they didn't want to know. Once a month, I watched the fund route payments, none traceable to Castor Systems. I had a third party send out congratulatory letters, full of vague phrases like, "Your decades of service have left a lasting impact on the community." It was all true in a way. They had given their lives to institutions. They had shaped minds, even if they never saw their own daughter's worth. Then came the conservatory issue. My niece, Miles's daughter, was denied enrollment at a private music conservatory because the tuition gap was too high. I only found out because someone forwarded a regional arts bulletin listing scholarship donors. The note in the margin said, "Looks like someone up there is watching over Ellie." She got in. A private donor, according to the head of admissions. No one suspected me, not my parents, not Miles, not Ellie. At Christmas, they toasted to grace in hard times, to anonymous generosity, to divine intervention. My father called the donation to his book contract a turning point. My mother said the educator's grant made her feel seen, and I sat in my workshop, soldering a contact plate onto a rotating lighthouse model, listening to rain tick against the windows. They were stable, safe, proud again. All because someone they never saw coming had reached in and rebuilt the system from underneath. That was the part they never understood. I didn't need their validation. I didn't even need their thanks. All I ever wanted was the space to create something that mattered, and maybe, just maybe, to prove I could hold them up, even if they'd never hold me back. That Thanksgiving was the first one I'd been invited to in years. The email came from Miles, short, formal, and clearly copy-pasted. No apologies, no warm language, just a list of times, the address, and a polite line about hoping to see you. I almost didn't go, but something in me had changed. I'd been sending checks into the void for years while they toasted ghosts. Maybe it was time they saw who'd really been holding the strings. So I showed up with a chest, an old brass-lined campaign box I'd restored myself. Inside were documents, patents filed under Castor Systems, press packets from museum clients, and a thick folder labeled Women Who Engineer History. I laid it all carefully across the passenger seat. I didn't bring food. I brought proof. It was raining when I pulled into my brother's driveway, the kind of cold, steady rain that blurred windshields and thoughts. The house was warm inside, overstuffed with people, the smell of rosemary and butter clinging to every corner. No one greeted me at the door. I found them in the dining room, a long table covered in linen and place cards. My name was scribbled on a napkin at the far end, barely legible. I sat, nodded, stayed quiet. Dinner started with the usual Castor performance, my father dominating conversation, my mother correcting his grammar, and Miles beaming while they listed his achievements. He had just returned from a climate summit in Zurich, featured in some international magazine I hadn't read. And to think, my mother said, lifting her glass, we raised a boy who speaks for the planet. There were soft claps, eyes turned to Miles. None turned to me. I waited until the turkey was carved, until the sides were passed, until the same tired story about Miles's first lab internship was told for the third time. Then, during dessert, I reached under the table and placed the box in front of me. "What's that?" my niece asked. I opened the lid slowly, like a magician. "Something I've been meaning to share," I said. I pulled out the press folder first, slid it down the table toward my mother, then the patents, then a printed map with 32 red pins up the coastline, each one a site we'd upgraded, automated, and preserved. "What is this?" my father asked. I looked at him. "It's the company I built, the one that funds your property taxes, and your meds, and Ellie's tuition." The room went still. Even the clink of forks stopped. Miles squinted at the stack of papers. "This is you?" "It's always been me," I said. "Every anonymous donor, every grant, every quiet little miracle you toasted over wine." My mother's face flushed. My father's jaw locked. This is fraud," he said suddenly, pushing back from the table. "You created fake names to funnel money? You could be arrested," I smiled. "I consulted a lawyer. It's legal, generous even." Miles laughed bitterly. "So what, you're a glorified mechanic playing philanthropist?" "No," I said, voice low. "I'm the woman who kept your lights on while you laughed about my failure. Who fixed more than just barometers. I fixed your lives." "You lied," my mother whispered. "You ignored me," I replied. "Now we're even." I stood, picked up the final folder, the donor contracts, and held them over the box like a closing statement. "The support you've received these last 4 years," I said, my voice even. "That was me." I let the silence breathe. "And it ends now." No one moved. No one argued. They just stared. And I walked out of that house like a woman finally untethered. I left Maine for good 6 weeks after that Thanksgiving dinner. There was no dramatic announcement, no farewell tour, no postcards. Just a moving van, a list of restoration clients handed off to Noel, and a one-way drive down the coast until the pine trees gave way to palms. I ended up in a small Florida waterfront town called Bow Harbor. Quiet, flat, salt-sweet air drifting in through the windows every morning. The kind of place where time felt slower, and nobody cared what your last name meant. The house I bought was a one-story cottage with faded blue shutters and a cracked porch swing. I fixed the floorboards the first week, installed new insulation the next, painted the front steps teal, just because I could. Then I opened the southern branch of Castor Systems. It started small, just me, a garage full of prototypes, and a rusted lighthouse control panel from the local historical society. Word spread faster than I expected. Within months, I had contracts with 3 regional museums and a boatyard turned art space that needed their old rigging display reanimated. But this time, it wasn't just business. This time, I built something else alongside it, a grand initiative I called the Renaissance Foundry Fund. It was meant for people like me, the unaccredited, the self-taught, the kids who rebuilt lawnmower engines in their mom's basements, while guidance counselors told them to aim lower. Applicants didn't need a resume, just photos of their work, a short essay, and an idea they couldn't stop thinking about. We funded 7 in the first round. A woman who built analog tide clocks from driftwood and bike parts, a teenager who retooled a tape deck into a light-sensitive mural controller, an older man who'd spent decades restoring wind gauges for the Navy but had never filed a patent. I held Sunday workshops in my backyard, built a long table from salvaged boat beams, strung cafe lights overhead, baked bread every week, and let people bring what they were building. And that's how I met Julian. He came to one of the early meetups with a small camera and a notebook full of questions. He was working on a documentary series about craftsmanship in the digital age. Wanted to understand why some people still used gears when they could just use code. I told him, because gears never forget. We ended up talking for hours about timelines and lighthouses, French jazz and tidal drift. He had the quiet confidence of someone who'd traveled just enough to know what was worth holding on to. Evenings turned into dinners. Dinners turned into slow, lazy walks by the marina. I didn't hide my success anymore. My name was on the Castor Systems website, on the workshop door, on the patent paperwork. Julian once asked me if I regretted not being seen earlier. No, I said. They saw what they wanted. Now I build what I want. The wind off the water smelled like citrus and solder that night. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally moving forward. Not to prove anything, not to outrun anyone, but because the tide was right and the engine was mine. The first letter came on thick cream stationery, postmarked from Vermont. It was from Miles. The handwriting was tight and precise, just like I remembered. But the tone was different, not polished, not distant, just quiet. Irene, I don't expect a response, but I want to say I was wrong. About everything. You didn't just prove us wrong. You did something we didn't even think was possible. You left, you built something real, and you helped us anyway. Without applause, without needing to be seen. That's more than I would have done. Miles. I read it 3 times, folded it once, then slid it into a drawer. A week later, an envelope arrived with my father's name in the corner. Inside, a single page, typed. Signed at the bottom with a trembling pen stroke. I underestimated you. I spoke out of pride and ignorance. I see that now. Thank you for what you did, even if I don't deserve it. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from Alden Castor. Then came the voicemail from my mother. Her voice, softer than I'd heard in years, crackled through the speaker like it had traveled across a decade instead of a country. Your father and I are going to be in Florida next month. I thought, if you had time, maybe we could meet, just to talk. Not for money, just talk. I didn't call back, but I picked a day. I picked a cafe. It was a quiet spot by the marina. The kind of place where the coffee came in mismatched mugs and the waitstaff let you sit for hours. They were already there when I arrived, sitting side by side in a booth, both of them looking smaller than I remembered. My mother's hair had grayed more than I expected. My father's jacket looked too big on him, like something he'd borrowed from a stronger version of himself. We didn't hug, we didn't cry, we talked. About Maine winters, about coastal exhibits, about Ellie's recital. No one mentioned the grants. No one asked about the money. The words hung in the air without being spoken, and somehow that was enough. At one point, my father reached into his coat and slid a newspaper clipping across the table. It was the Women Who Engineer History article, creased at the fold. "I read this twice," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Should have read it sooner," I nodded. "It's a good piece." He hesitated, then added, "You built something remarkable. It wasn't effusive, it wasn't a confession, but it was real, and that was all I needed." When we stood to leave, my mother touched my arm, just lightly. "I hope we see you again," she said. I didn't answer. As I walked back toward the water, I felt no weight in my chest, no bitterness, no ache. That meeting wasn't closure, it was confirmation. I had moved on, and I didn't need them to come with me. Every Sunday evening, the backyard of my Florida house glowed with life. I strung soft yellow lights between the jacaranda trees, laid out mismatched plates on a long weathered table I'd built from salvaged dockwood, and set a fresh loaf of bread on a wooden board in the center. The same one I baked every week, rosemary and sea salt, still warm from the oven. It wasn't fancy. That was the point. The people who gathered here weren't dressed up. They came in coveralls, cut-off jeans, boots with cracked soles. They carried toolboxes, sketch pads, resin prints. One guy brought a clock he was building from parts of a busted lawnmower. Another brought a working prototype of a foghorn you could trigger with a pocket radio. They were the ones I funded through the Renaissance Foundry Fund. Tinkerers, builders, garage inventors with no degrees but more vision than most CEOs I'd met. We talked shop, we passed wine, we argued about torque ratios and the best soldering irons. Julian sometimes brought his camera, but mostly he just listened and poured drinks. Noel flew down when he could. He'd become something of a legend among the new interns, the original apprentice. He liked to stand on the porch and play old jazz on his portable speaker while people brainstormed under the string lights. It felt like family, but without the expectations, without the weight, just people who saw each other clearly. One night after a dinner where someone unveiled a water pressure-powered automaton made from old sink parts, I was invited to speak at the Florida State Small Business Gala. I almost didn't go, but Tamsin texted, "Go. Be seen, Irene." So I went. I wore dark green linen. Nothing flashy. Julian sat in the front row, phone in hand but not recording. Just watching, like always. They called me to the stage and introduced me as a systems designer, entrepreneur, inventor. But when I stepped to the mic, I didn't talk about Castor Systems. Not directly. I told them this. For a long time, I thought I needed approval to belong. I tried to fit my work into boxes: academic, professional, respectable. But the truth is, I was never building for titles. I was building for function, for curiosity, for the simple, stubborn belief that some things still matter even when no one's watching. I used to think legacy was something you inherited. Turns out, it's something you build. With your own hands. There was a pause, and then quiet applause. But I didn't care about the crowd. I cared about the feeling in my chest, like wind pushing open a door that had always been there. That Sunday, back in my yard, I raised a glass to everyone at the table. To the people who make things, I said, even when no one's looking. They raised theirs in return. And as the sea breeze rolled in and the tide clocks ticked softly from the porch wall, I smiled. No longer moving forward for validation, only for truth.